2. Jasmine. I told myself I was only here out of curiosity. I was standing in front of the martial arts studio door with the same insignia as Anthony's jacket. A black circle, edged in yellow with red hands in the center. I'd recognized it from the flyer stuck to the door of his restaurant. He'd probably hung it there himself. Free walk-in self-defense classes for women. After our scene yesterday, I'd taken one of the little tags with the address as I left, even though I swore I never wanted to see him again. I certainly wasn't here because I wanted to be close to him. You were only a silly little girl who followed me around. I cringed at the memory. My cheeks stung from the embarrassment. It wasn't even the insult, though that also throbbed like a bruise. More that he knew better than anyone how the other kids had excluded me and used this knowledge to hurt me. Kind, thoughtful Anthony, who had once spent hours trying to return a baby rosefinch to its nest. I wanted to forget this present-day version, this hard, closed face and averted eyes, but I couldn't stop thinking about that red bracelet on his wrist. Even though many Chinese wound up in Chinatown, seeing him again still felt like some sort of cosmic coincidence, like fate allowed us to meet from 1,000 miles away. I'd made him a bracelet like that for his 14th birthday. I had no money, and I was too shy to give him one of my drawings. Perhaps I'd already sensed that change was coming. My parents were entertaining visitors in our home, men who laughed too loudly and looked at me out of the corners of their eyes as they drank their rice liquor. Ba's friends had never done that before. Anthony and I had been sent to the stream to catch crabs for his birthday celebration that evening. I was giddy to be released from my chores and swung my legs as I balanced on the luggage rack of his rickety bicycle, twirling my woven basket with one hand. "Stop that," he called, pedaling hard on the dusty, narrow road that ran through the fields. His bony back was warm against the tanned skin of my arm. "You're going to make us crash. We're almost there." "You're such an old man," I retorted. The moment we arrived, I leapt off the bike and took off. "Race you." I heard his footsteps pounding behind me. I'd always been faster. He'd recently grown a couple of inches, though, and shot past me. We were both laughing and panting by the time we reached the base of the waterfall. Smooth sheets of iridescent stone glimmered in the sunlight. I loved the rushing music of the falling stream, the smell of mud and grass, the spray cool and damp against my cheeks. The water had eroded the plunge pool. On the periphery, where the waves were calm and sediment collected, we rolled up our simple cotton pants and waited. The sand tickled my toes. "There's one," I cried, pointing to a flash of motion I'd seen beneath the surface. Anthony bent down at once. He expertly pushed with his thumb on the crab's back and flipped it into the basket I held. The river crab scrabbled futilely to clamber up the smooth bamboo sides. Soon we had the basket mostly filled and climbed the outcropping that hung over the swirling plunge pool. We settled into the small, dry indentation in the rock where we always sat, warm from the sun. We were trying to count the crabs we'd caught, all scrambling and swarming, when he said, as I known he would, "I think some of these are too small. They won't be good eating." I let him drop about a third of them back into the water before I laid my hand on his arm, right above the mole in the crook of his elbow. "You're too soft-hearted, Anthony. We can't free them all." He hunched his shoulders and stared at the ledge. "My folks won't mind." I stared into the distance. The words were thick and stuck in my throat. "Ma will be angry with me. She'll say our family lost faith by not contributing enough." His eyes flew to my profile, his gaze stricken. I would be beaten if we didn't bring enough. My parents weren't like his. who could afford to buy any meat or fish they wanted. Let's go catch some more then. I shook my head and smiled at him. His eyebrows were furrowed, the moon-shaped scar on his forehead from when he'd fallen on a protruding nail as a toddler, lighter than the rest of his skin. We still have enough. Hey, I made something for you. I pulled my gift from my pocket and held it out to him. Two people connected by the red thread will always be tied together, I said, as he stared at it. Ma never told me stories, but I always listened when she put my twin brother Hong to bed. I would turn to the wall, so I didn't have to see her pet his cheek or tussle his hair. The magical cord might stretch or tangle, but it'll never break, no matter how far away they might be from each other. Anthony's cheekbones turned bright pink. This is for... What? Boyfriend, girlfriend. I gasped and snatched my hand away, still clutching the bracelet. No! Had I not heard the whole tale? I started babbling, the waterfall roaring in my ears. That's not what it is for us. It only means we're best friends and always will be. This was a stupid idea. I can give you something else. His coloring settled back into its usual tawny hues. He reached out and loosened my fist to uncover the bracelet. I like it. Will you put it on me? Still embarrassed, I avoided his eyes as I tied it around his skinny wrist. I wanted to decorate it with beads, but I didn't have any. He looked at the colorful knots of string, green, yellow, turquoise, and orange, neatly set off from the rest of the bracelet by a dark gold thread I'd taken from my mother's sewing basket. These bracelets are supposed to be a pair. You should have a matching one. I shook my head. I had wanted to make myself one, but I was afraid of being discovered, though technically I was allowed to use the sewing basket materials for mending. I don't need one. I'll make it for you, he promised. For months after that, I caught him with little ragged bits of red thread in his pocket, all knotted and twisted. He never succeeded in making anything that didn't look like something the cat had thrown up, though. We didn't know it then, but we were already speeding through our final months together. My friendship with Anthony had formed the safe boundaries of my childhood, a buttress against the cold disdain of my mother and Hong's infuriating teasing. I'd found shelter within those walls without knowing it. Soon they started to crumble, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. Nothing at all. A year and a half later, Anthony was gone. I hadn't expected him to resent me so much. This adult Anthony didn't want me in his life, and I respected that. I had never wanted him to be unhappy. If only I could see if those knotted beads were on his bracelet. Then I'd know it was the same one I'd given him. I wouldn't pursue him beyond that. I couldn't have someone connected to my village in my life anyway. If he hadn't moved away years ago, I wouldn't even have considered following him here. This was pure curiosity. I'd leave as soon as I checked out the bracelet, and we would never need to see each other again. It wasn't like I was lonely for a friend. A pang ran through me, and I ignored it. Except for Grandma, who had passed on. I couldn't trust anyone, not even the people I loved most. If I saw him here, I'd act surprised. No one could blame a woman living in New York City for taking a self-defense class. I steeled myself, then hauled open the heavy metal door. It took me a few tries. This must have been some kind of test, where only people strong enough to open the door were allowed to take their class. A sturdy-looking young woman with a blunt-cut pyramid of hair sat behind a rickety table with the sign-up sheet in front of her. When she spoke, her voice was low and assured. To my relief, she addressed me in Chinese. Hi, You must be new. I'm Yan. Please fill in your name with your phone number. I hunched my shoulders. I'm not sure I'll be staying. Yan's voice was pragmatic and calm. That's no problem. But for our records, everyone coming through must sign in. Otherwise, you can't enter. I scribbled my name and contact information on the sheet. Go down the hallway. Changing rooms to your right, studios to the left. I hesitated. I don't have anything to change into. Why hadn't this occurred to me? Probably because I didn't have much other clothing aside from my usual plain pants and shirts. She looked me up and down. There was no judgment in her gaze. What you have on is fine, and you can do the class barefoot, so you're all set. As I took a step toward the dressing room, I felt lightheaded, like I'd been spinning around at high speed. This was a terrible idea. No one from our village could know I was in the beautiful country. I was turning to leave when I heard Anthony's voice behind me. What are you doing here? I wrapped an arm around my stomach and tried to calm my racing pulse. My voice wavered. I could ask you the same thing. You're the man at a woman's self-defense class. I'm teaching with my Uncle Nick. Of course. I remembered the uncle who lived in America and would bring him here one day. Anthony had changed into a black kung fu uniform that stretched over his muscular shoulders, belted at his narrow waist. Even barefoot, he was taller than I recalled. I stared at the long sleeves that covered his wrists and heaved a sigh. He glanced at Yan, who was still behind the desk. She was watching us with avid curiosity and a hint of wariness. A slight flush crept up his jaw. Can I talk to you for a moment? As I followed his stiff back down the hallway, I had a sudden urge to jump him from behind and wrap my arms and legs around him like a monkey. When we were younger, I would sneak up on him like that while he was practicing shooting marbles in the dirt outside his house. I used to cackle like a maniac when he jumped out of his skin. Anthony had always possessed an inherent faith in the goodness of everything. Maybe I could convince him not to be so upset with me anymore. He led me into a small office. There were framed photos of students in kung fu uniforms winning prizes, and a girl who seemed to have nothing to do with martial arts. There were countless shots of her from childhood on. Anthony's cousin, perhaps? His uncle obviously loved his daughter very much, I thought wistfully. The office was crammed with trophies that overflowed all the available shelf space, spilled onto the desk and floor. Anthony had always taken kung fu lessons back home, but no matter how many times I'd asked, I'd never been allowed to join him. Ma thought it was a waste of money for a girl. His guitar case and an animal carrier were stashed in a corner. A 3-colored cat was prowling around and rubbed itself against my knee, purring outrageously. I leaned down to pet its thick, soft fur. I would have loved to sketch its white paws and stripy tail, the blaze of orange behind one ear, the gray pattern that descended over one eye like a pirate's patch. When the cat ambled away, I looked up to find Anthony facing me, with his arms crossed, his lips set in a determined line. I'd like you to leave. The words sliced into me. I flinched before I could hide my expression. And from the guilt that edged into his face, I knew he'd seen it. I ducked my head and took a step toward the door. Fine. Goodbye, Anthony. His voice behind me. Why on earth do you want to take a self-defense course anyway? I shrugged, but didn't turn around. Before I could touch the doorknob, he said hurriedly, as if loath to see me go. Do you really expect me to believe this was a coincidence? Now I'd had enough. All my tension condensed into fury, and heat rushed to my face as I turned to him. What should you think then? That I followed you to this foreign country and I'm just hoping you'll fall to your knees and beg me for forgiveness for your rudeness, even though against all odds, after all these years, we've found each other again? The lines on his face hardened. You don't need to make fun, don't I? I said, walking toward him. I apologize to you, Anthony. You didn't need to lash out at me. No, you listen now. This is your studio, but it's my turn to talk, and if you feel the need to run away, be my guest. I waved at the door. He clenched his jaw but didn't move. His eyes were bright with indignation underneath the crescent-shaped scar, faded now. He looked as stubborn as he ever did as a boy, and at the corner of his left eye were the same 3 little freckles that formed a triangle. At these reminders of the Anthony I had loved, I sighed, the anger leaking out of me. I shut you out of my life with no warning. It must have seemed like... He broke in, his voice harsh and furious. Suddenly, he was looming over me with his fists clenched. Like you were too good for the rest of us? With your new life and big house and him? I cowered, but managed to squeeze out, low and urgent. I had no choice. He scoffed. Of course you didn't. No choice but to treat me like trash on your shoe. Ignoring me even though I ran after you like an idiot, hoping at least to be your friend. Time and time again, I thought you hadn't seen me, that you were busy. The excuses I made for you in my head. I couldn't... What? Couldn't treat me with any type of decency? He raised his voice, a muscle ticking in his jaw. Couldn't what, Jasmine? Couldn't have picked me instead? You were my girlfriend. At this, we both froze. We were breathing hard. I stared at him incredulously. What? I was never your girlfriend. He deflated and looked down, unable to meet my eyes. He stammered, It was a secret. I said, enunciating slowly. So secret that even I didn't know about it? A hot flush crept up his chest and neck, and he nodded. Now it was my turn to avoid his gaze. I stared at the floor as I said in a tiny voice, I tried. Your parents refused. What? It was an explosion of air and disbelief. I risked a glance upward and he was flabbergasted, his eyes wide, mouth gaping open. His lips moved, though he seemed unable to speak. At his obvious surprise, something inside me loosened. He hadn't known. I'd spent years wondering. I gave a short laugh. They always had their eyes on the beautiful country for you, Anthony. Or did you never grasp the reason they gave you an American name from the day you were born? They understood that your uncle would bring you here, and that your future would be abroad, not in our little village. I knew we weren't involved, but I would rather have been with you than... I told my parents I would accept an arranged marriage if they asked your family first. Believe me, I had to fight to make my folks agree. Why didn't you ask me directly? His voice caught, straining to contain some emotion I struggled to decipher. Frustration? Anger? I was still staring at his uniform. I was embarrassed. I never saw you that way. I was sure they'd talk to you and you'd find out. To be honest, when you tried to approach me after the wedding, I was still resentful and wounded. I thought you felt guilty for rejecting me when the matchmaker approached your family. Anyway, whether it was up to you or your parents, I wasn't good enough. There was utter silence. Then he took me by the chin and tilted my head up to meet his eyes. His expression was unreadable. I wrenched my face away as a hot tear overflowed. I dashed it away, angry at myself for displaying vulnerability while he remained so stoic. But fine, Anthony. I understand. I don't see any trace of the boy I was friends with anymore. That boy may have been hurt. And yes, you've made it very clear that you're anything but hurt by me. But he would have heard me out. He was kind to every living thing, thought the best of everyone. I'm sorry I intruded on your life here. I don't know why I came to see you again. I won't bother you anymore. He was speechless as I backed away from him. I strode out of the office and toward the exit as quickly as I could. I could hear him coming after me. I wanted nothing more to do with him. Yan stared at me as I grabbed the handle, pushed the main metal door, and bounced off of it. What was that thing made of, lead? I felt his hand on my arm. Jasmine. I stopped, but I didn't turn around. We both stood there, silent. He squeezed me gently and said quietly, It was too much for me. I couldn't stand to be on the cusp of friendship. I couldn't bear the memories. There were so many emotions raging through me that I didn't know what I was feeling. I wrenched my arm from his grasp and rammed my whole weight against the door, running out of the studio and out of his life.